we're moving into our first conversation for this morning with Raphael Manzanero, the Executive Director of Friends for Conservation and Development.
Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Thanks.
So, of course, this is our opportunity to check in on what's happening in the Chiquibul. There have been some recent releases coming out talking about what's happening there. So let's just get started with an update.
Yes, certainly. Well, the releases are more based in terms of our research that we would conduct. I mean, at FCD, we have our own research unit that's comprised of 4 of us, along with a biologist. And so what we tend to do is basically to look at the conservation targets that we have. A conservation target is really more the sort of the specific animal species or things that we would have really to monitor, because we cannot really monitor everything. So we basically would have to handpick, based on criteria. And so our research is basically based on that. It can be like the Chiquibul Caverns, it can be the Bradley Forest, in this case, the Scarlett Macaws. So one of the research, basically concludes that the Scarlett Macaws are having really a serious issue in terms of illegal wildlife trafficking. We have realized, and in fact, it was really astounding even to us that have been here for, I would say from 2005 that we have been working with Scarlett Macaws. We realized that the losses that we are having are 4, 5, 6 times much more than what we had anticipated. And so it is really a serious problem in terms of that population.
You're very specific in calling it illegal wildlife trafficking, which is different from poaching, right? Would you explain?
Yes. The idea of illegal wildlife trafficking is basically the extraction of an animal and is basically moved across, in this case, across a border, and to be sold in terms of, or it becomes a part of the pet trade. Scarlett macaws and other parrots have been, targeted over many years. And in fact, nowhere in Belize, in terms of marine or terrestrial creatures, we do not really know how much we actually have been losing over the years. I don't think there's any authority in Belize, presently, who can be able to indicate clearly how much are the losses. And that includes, of course, flora and fauna, like the rosewood. All of that is basically illegal wildlife trafficking as well.
It's all driven by our desire as people to have exotic animals, to have certain kinds of trees or plants that we could say, well, look, I have this yellowhead parrot, or I have this scarlet macaw, in my home. And when you think about it in the context of how huge the Chiquibul Forest is, and the fact that these birds, specifically the scarlet macaws you've mentioned, they cover that entire area in terms of where they go and nest and that sort of stuff. So it's a very difficult task to be able to monitor where they go and who are the persons who either come into our country or even perhaps Belizeans are maybe involved in this illegal activity. How have you guys been able to either track or keep an eye on what is taking place insofar as scarlet macaws?
Well, a lot of it is really, of course, having a presence on the ground. We spend $100,000 or so in terms of only monitoring the scarlet macaws.
Wow.
It takes us 7 months. And frankly, looking at the numbers for this year, we were able to see only 10 of them that were able to fly wild and free from the areas that we have been monitoring. So in reality, it's like $10,000 a piece that we are investing. Now, only 10 is basically what we are able really to monitor and to ensure that we have a human presence. If we start to look at the numbers, however, of the losses that particularly this year is demonstrating, goodness, we probably are losing some 30, 40 of these birds. So the idea is, how can we really reach to those other remote areas to be able to monitor them?
Yeah, and that was going to be my question. If you aren't monitoring the areas, how do you know what's being lost?
In this case, in terms of the macaws, we were able to find out more because of our counterparts in Guatemala.
Okay.
So we were able now really to define much more clearly the sort of the steps that are being, or the process, the mechanisms that people are using. It is not really known where these parrots end. But interestingly enough, the organized crime in terms of wildlife species is becoming much more bigger in Latin American countries particularly. We have heard about rhinos and elephants in Africa, but basically now it's, over the last, I would say over the last 7 years or so, it has been moving now into Latin American countries. So the wildlife species, for example, jaguars, you have heard about jaguars that the fangs can be used, and the crocodiles, the tails or so.
Speaking of which, if you're talking about jaguars, we've seen in Belize recently this phenomenon of beheading jaguars, it is the overall thinking that these incidents are happening by people who send the head of the jaguar, in this case, perhaps to someone who wants to have it placed on a wall or whatsoever, taxidermy.
It's possible, the claws, the fangs are used. In the case of macaws, it's actually the specimen, is the live specimen. But interestingly enough, we have realized that the illegal wildlife traffickers are basically coming in at a time when they know that these birds are highly susceptible. Our request has been therefore that for those areas far away, which we are unable now to put in the manpower. If we want to protect the Scarlett Macaws in Chiquibul today, like starting February, March of this coming year, we would have to increase our budget for about 3 to 4 times. That's $400,000 to put in only
Just
for macaws.
Just to protect macaws.
And so we cannot really do that. We don't have the resources. The other alternative is basically now really to remove them if we know that they're at high risk of being stolen. And put them in a lab where we can be able to just raise them, and then we just then release them. We actually have tried it twice, and it really worked out quite well. So it can be done.
Can you explain to us what is the mechanism that FCD uses to protect the bird itself? Because we've seen images of them crawling, of rangers climbing up trees, checking on nests, and it's actually like it's a monitoring system, right?
Yes, exactly. So what we tend to do is, first of all, we have to go out and look at the nests.
Okay.
So we look at the potential nests and cavities, and after we are able really to record them and document them, then by starting February, March, we are able then really to put in the men on the ground where we know for sure there are the cavities that are active.
So they stay in the area where the nest is?
Yes, they stay in for up to 2 weeks. Just like the traditional ranger, they would stay in. And now we are now also intending now to open even much more now for the volunteer, of a volunteer program.
You'll forgive the analogy here. There is an ad that is being run by Belikin where they focus on one of those persons who is in the Chiquibul, and he's perhaps a biologist that deals with the same Scarlett Macaw.
That's correct.
And I think what that does is raise awareness. While it is an ad promoting a bear, the idea is that it raises awareness on how important this species of bird is to Belize.
It is really a bird that we would need to put in more interventions. On the last census that we conducted, there's no, there's no less than 345, individuals. The entire population in the world of Scarlett Macaws are estimated to be over 1,000 or so, 1,100 or so, 1,100. So it's not really a lot that are left across the world. So we're looking at Guatemala, we're looking at Mexico, and these are subspecies, and this one is considered to be already endangered. So the macaws, in terms of our projections, based upon what we know today, based upon the number of birds that are living in the country, that are being stolen, we believe that it won't really take a long time for this bird really to disappear. And now they fly from the western Maya Mountains to the eastern Maya Mountains. I had the opportunity of visiting a couple of the guys down along the area of Red Bank. And in there, also the vegetation is being cut. The seed trees that these birds actually fly into really to feed on those kind of vegetations. That habitat is also being altered. And so this species, on one hand, you can see a habitat destruction, and on the other side, across the Maya Mountains, you can see the illegal wildlife trafficking. And so we'll have to do a much more comprehensive, sort of a strategy if we really want to keep these birds into the future.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're raising the flag once again, identifying the fact that we are losing macaws. Your average is about 25.
Or more,
Or more. And that you need to put in additional measures for protection. Now, you clearly pointed out that if you were to use the same mechanism that you are right now, monitoring the individual nests, it would be very costly. So what are some of the options? You spoke of using volunteers. How would that work?
The idea of volunteers is that on the safer areas, we actually can put them, we can deploy them in there, and that releases us from our other staff to be able to go into the other remote areas. That's one. The second one is, of course, now to put in more rangers and really the enforcement rangers into place. But that really means that we have to move them from one area, either from the western border, and put them into the habitat of macaws. And so that is really something that we always have to be leveraging about, because the point is, what is really much more a hotspot? Is the hotspot really more cattle ranching or versus the Scarlett Macaws? And that has always been really a contention at FCD over the many years.
Yeah. Because the range of issues that you have to address within the Chiquibul itself, you have your cattle ranching, you have your illegal farming, you have your illegal logging, you have, now we're talking about macaws, we're talking about gold panning. There are just so many different issues that are priorities. They're competing priorities.
Right.
So, who have you spoken to about the concern that you're seeing with the loss of the macaws, and how do you propose to move forward?
And that primarily has been the Ministry of Forestry and protected areas, because ultimately, even though if we want really to extract the parrots and put them in a lab, we certainly do require the permits. FCD does not really have only the go-ahead only to do it automatically. There's a whole procedure that has to be done, and finally it's the government that has to basically give us the endorsement for us to do it. And so that would be the ministry. Over the last 2 years, we have been providing the protocols. We have been demonstrating on why we have to do it. But I must say that we did only 2 years, and then over the last 2 years, in 2016, 2017, we have not been able to do it again.
Raf, let's segue into another conversation here and touch on the issue of cattle ranching. I know it's a major problem in the Chiquibul. We're talking about an expansive acreage of land west of the country that borders Guatemala. And I believe you have mentioned before that cattle ranching has to do with some of the drug activity that's happening across the border as well. What have those efforts been like? I know I was asking you earlier, with the forward operating base at South Cebada, if that would have helped to kind of stem or stave off this kind of activity. What has that been like?
I think I would say over the last 4 years, we have been here, and I don't know if people really then, tend to get tired of just hearing me or so, but thanks so much, guys, for inviting me to be here. But cattle ranching up until now, we have not really seen a prominent nor proactive move in terms of addressing this. We have even highlighted why it is important really to hit on it as soon as we can. But certainly, my feeling is that because it's within the adjacency zone, which is more a sensitive area, that it has taken much more now other institutions to become involved, such as the OAS. And that has basically, in a way, have put in other kind of elements and measures to be done. For example, informing the Guatemalans, I mean, having probably even the military forces in Guatemala to know about this and to sensitize them, but that takes quite some time.
Yeah.
And that is what we don't have in our hands. You know, we are not really that certain the number of ranches that are pretty much involved in terms of narcotics. I mean, it's sort of difficult at this stage, but I think, you know, from all other trends that we are seeing, you know, we know that's where it will end. And so I mean, the worst scenario is that if they have a grip on the land, then we will not be able to eradicate them that easy.
Yeah.
You know, it is an active zone. In the last, you know, overflight that was done, it shows that there's even a much more proliferation of activities, even in the Columbia River Forest Reserve now.
What you're saying is that you're seeing more cattle ranches, or you're seeing an expansion of the current cattle ranches?
Okay, what is happening is that, I mean, traditionally all the lands in the area over the years have been used for agricultural farming.
Yes.
So in reality, even though we might not be seeing like new clearings,
Yeah.
it's the transformation of the land into another activity, from agricultural farming to cattle ranching. And so what you can see on the landscape are really more pastures and more fences. And so in my last of the press releases that I did was basically saying that it would seem to us, you know, from the observations done from the air, is that the people are investing more, like in posts, in ponds, in more cattle heads, and so there would seem then to be an advancement of that activity, I mean, along the adjacency
Can
zone.
you explain for our viewers what the effect of cattle ranching is and
Yeah.
how impactful this is? Perhaps they're hearing it, but they don't really grasp
Yeah.
the
Why it's a
gravity of
concern.
it. Yeah.
I think, I mean, there's a couple of things here. One is that it is no longer like the chateau activity where people used to come in and just be able to pick in and return back again. I mean, this really would seem to be much more an activity that is staying there for sure, because East Guatemala's bringing their cattle into Belizean territory in the first place. So in other words, it's more like their property.
Yeah.
In the case of Chate, it was our property.
It's like
Right.
squatting, but with cattle.
Exactly, and so, and it's right along the adjacency zone, and it's going to expand more. And in fact, we are already seeing that some of it might be sporing outside of the 1 kilometer.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, what that means is that there's a much more grip that is occurring along on the landscape. Now, I mean, many of the areas have already been cleared before. So if you fly over, you might not really see a lot of smoke. You might not be able to see a lot of the virgin forest that is disappearing. It's really more the transformation of that agricultural farming fields into cattle ranching, into pastures.
So you clear
Now-
forests to have just bare grass.
Yeah.
Exactly, and what has happened is that, I mean, over the years from 1984, you know, there has been clearing for agricultural farming along the adjacency zone. But as the farmer was coming in and putting their crops in the area, it would seem that either two things might be happening. One is that these poor farmers are now being used to actually plant now the pastures, right? And so they are being paid. Or secondly, they either might be threatened on their lives. That either they abandon the land and it's being taken over by someone else. And so the problem for us today, even with our Guatemalan counterparts, is, are we dealing now with poor people, or is it another set of individuals? If it's another set of individuals, which seems to be apparent, is we need a different strategy now to work on.
Yeah.
And that strategy might, and as how I have mentioned before, you know, once these people are coming in, like Ladinos and other individuals in the territory, you know, we are not actually dealing with poor people. You know, we are dealing with more organized groups. And so I think the government of Belize has been afraid of confrontations.
Yeah.
And precisely that is what we are trying to prevent into the future, because if we leave these things to occur much more and prominently, you know, I can bet that there are going to be serious problems along that western border.
And you have spoken of what has been seen in other areas. I know in the Mexico-Guatemala border, where they've found cattle ranches, the persons involved have been tied to organized crime. Do you know who owns the ranches that have been established at the Belize-Guatemala border?
I think there have been some names, and in fact, the military forces, for example, have been documenting some of this for quite some years. I mean, some of the at least a family that we know about has been expanding over the many years. And the conversion, once again, is from the agricultural fields into pastures. And so some of these people have been identified. Now the issue is, of course, the expansion that's going to take place. I mean, you heard about the Amazon fires, where it's basically then the loss of the forest that ultimately is going to continuously be occurring. In that case, not for agricultural farming, but for cattle ranching. I mean, cattle ranching is quite big, and as how you know, I mean, most of the cattle actually ends up in Mexico. And from there, then it's converted as a product. But a lot of it, I mean, Central American countries, from Nicaragua, from Honduras, from Belize, there is trespass of cattle going into, and finally into Mexico.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, we have our own cattle industry as well. And I've also thought of things like the health issues. We have to be very stringent about what comes into the country in terms of animal health. But you pointed out, and I think anybody who hears this interview may be able to understand that there is this sensitivity involved because of the adjacency zone, and oftentimes you don't want to, for lack of a better term, ruffle feathers too much. You also have your limitations. I mean, we've always said over and over that FCD is an environmental agency, and not a security, a part of Belize's security forces. So have you liaised with the Guatemalan side to be able to have them do interventions from their side? What is the difficulty there? You clearly identify the families, which means you know the names, which means you know the people involved.
Well, there are two things to that. I mean, one is that the Guatemalans also have a serious problem on their own protected areas. As we speak, there can be about 30,000 heads of cattle at Laguna del Tigre that the country has not been able really to finish off in their own protected areas. And secondly, you will realize that, I mean, some of these individuals can be dangerous. And so there's only so much that also our counterparts can do. It has to be a work of the state. In the case of Belize, of course, we have informed the national security agents. I feel that we need to be much more proactive in that that stance, like in many cases. And I think we have discussed this also in multiple occasions, that a problem that is so far away, that is not seen, it tends to be forgotten. Now, what I can say is that, and I think I mentioned it the last time that we were here, we were documenting about 80 or 81, pastures across the area. And in fact, it starts way down from the Vaca and way down to Jalacte in the Toledo district. The Toledo district is now being much more targeted now. Now there is only one CP. Well, actually there is Santa Rosa also, although I'm not so sure if it is an OP or a CP, because there are no rangers there. But the fact is that that is an area that has also been actually vacant for a long time. In fact, I have always been, and we have discussed this with Derek, I said, but how is it that Guatemalans have not really taken over the Columbia River? Because there is a lack of presence in that zone. But it's really more the topography. It's completely, sort of much more.
Is it the Columbia River Forest, or the Columbia Forest Reserve, as it's known, falls under the oversight of Yakshe?
No, actually, that's only directly under the Forest Department alone.
It's forest. Okay.
Although there are the communities that are dotted along on the fringe. The Maya Leaders Association and other organizations are much more now looking at that, because as how you will reckon, I mean, many of the communities have started now to see much more the presence of Guatemalans like nearby. And so they have, I would say, raised also their red flag, that there is a concern. The problem though is that it has not really been well documented. If you ask anybody like how much the acreage, there's no figures on that.
They just know that they've seen it and they've seen the damage.
That's correct, right. So
you have once again brought to our attention, I think, what are very important issues. Clearly losing the macaws, and also finding an acceptable way to address the cattle ranching that seems to be expanding. You also had a visit from members of the judiciary recently. Tell me about the purpose of that visit.
Well, the purpose was really more to sensitize them, Environmental crimes is one of the things that, our protected area managers, whenever you bring them here to your set, more than likely they do have issues, either marine or terrestrial. And so environmental crimes are becoming much more prominent, and the laws are there, the regulations are there. And so the idea is really more to sensitize them so that whenever we bring in a guy into courts, then at least they do have the backdrop on what really is occurring, and that it is not really a petty crime, because these things can be amounting then to thousands or millions of dollars, like in the case of illegal logging. And so it was really more our purpose really to sensitize them. I am grateful that the Chief Justice, the Chief Magistrate, and the magistrates were there. The recommendation was, of course, to bring in also other of the second tier individuals, such as the prosecutors, to sensitize them as well. But finally, our take is really to do also an exchange with the judiciary system from Guatemala. Apparently, they already have made some contacts before, but in Guatemala there are some lessons to be learned. For example, they have an environmental magistrate. And so they deal only with this kind of environmental issues. And so more than likely, if a Guatemalan is caught, like with the Scarlett Macaws in Guatemala, more than likely it's going to be that office that is going to be dealing with them.
That's right.
And so it's really more a matter of sensitizing them.
Okay. Well, Raphael, we thank you for coming in and giving us an update. Of course, we can't always make it out to the Chiquibul, so you bring the information to us.
Certainly.
There's a
Thanks so
standing
much.
invitation.
Yes, the invitation is still there. Certainly.
All right, we're going to go
Thank you.
ahead now and take a break. And when we come back, we'll be talking about the first annual Belize Forensic Science Symposium. Please stay tuned.